The letter was written in pencil on lined notebook paper, folded once and tucked inside a leather-bound breeding journal that had been started in March of 1928 by a woman who believed the land would tell you what it needed if you learned how to listen. Ida Mosley found the letter on the morning of December 11th, 1976, 2 hours after she found her mother dead at the kitchen table. The table was the same Formica top table that had been in the kitchen since 1952. Her mother, Bones Mosley, had been sitting in the same pressed-back oak chair she'd sat in every morning for 26 years, a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her, her hand resting palm down on the oilcloth placemat as though she'd been reaching for something that wasn't there. The coroner would later say it had been a heart attack. Quick, painless, the kind of death people called a blessing when they were trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Ida was 30 years old. She had been widowed for 3 years. She had been running the Mosley home place alone since her husband Ennis died in the autumn of 1973 when a Massey Ferguson 4900 swather threw a header bearing on a windy October afternoon, and the header arm collapsed onto the operator's seat with Ennis underneath it. She had buried her father in 1968, her grandmother Perry in 1962, now her mother. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the coroner left. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into a place after someone has been carried out and won't be coming back. The leather journal was on the shelf above the stove where it had always been, next to a sealed glass jar the size of a half-gallon mason jar, and a small wooden seed counting tray carved from a single block of mesquite. Ada took the journal down. She opened it. The handwriting on the first page was small and neat, dated March 14th, 1928. Her grandmother's hand. 58 consecutive growing seasons of breeding notes, weather records, germination tests yield tallies. The last entry was in her mother's hand, dated October 22nd, 1976, 6 weeks before she died. The letter was tucked between pages 46 and 47. It was addressed to Ida in her grandmother's handwriting. The date at the top said November 14th, 1961. Perry Mosley had died 6 months later. Ida unfolded the letter. She read it once, then she read it again. My granddaughter, when the hybrids fail you, it will be in a year nobody is expecting. The line we made between 1928 and 1934 was selected for stem strength against hail and drought and the wind that comes off the Llano Estacado in May. The hybrids will outyield us in good years. We will outyield them in the years the weather is bad. Plant the line. Perrier. Ada set the letter down. She looked at the glass jar on the shelf. The jar had been sealed with a fresh layer of paraffin around the rim. Inside was seed, brown oblong, slightly larger than hybrid grain sorghum. The label on the side of the jar, written in her grandmother's hand, said Bones's Black Amber. Foundation seed, 1934 selection, Texas A&M Lubbock Station. The seed was 42 years old. Ida reached up and took the jar down. She held it up to the window light. The seed inside looked viable. It looked like seed that had been stored cold and dry and dark for 4 decades in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and cornbread, and the kind of care that doesn't show up in agricultural extension bulletins. She set the jar on the table. She sat down. She folded her hands. Outside, the flat, red clay plains of Castro County, Texas stretched away to the horizon. 320 acres. 80 of it was the home place block, the land her grandmother Perry Mosley had selected in 1934 to refresh the Bones's Black Amber line every 5th year. The land her mother had continued to refresh every 5th year for 42 consecutive years. The land that now belonged to Ida. She thought about her grandmother, who had been born in 1899 on a homestead outside Kittock, Texas, and who had attended Texas A&M College of Agriculture on a state scholarship and had taken her bachelor's degree in agronomy in 1923 with a thesis on sorghum, kernel hardness, and stem strength under field hail conditions. She thought about her mother, who had learned the refreshment cycle from Perry in 1948 when she was 14, and who had kept the line alive through 30 years of hybrid dominance without once planting a commercial hybrid seed on the home place block. She thought about her husband Ennis, who had been 34 years old when he died, and who had told her 3 months before the accident that if anything ever happened to him, she should do whatever her mother thought was right about the farm. She thought about the letter, plant the line. Ida stood. She walked to the kitchen window. She looked out at the 80-acre block. The stubble from the autumn harvest was still standing, waiting to be disked under in the spring. She made her decision. She would test the seed. She would read the breeding notes. She would rebuild the grain bin behind the milk house. She would calibrate the 4-row planter for the slightly larger kernel size. And in March of 1978, 15 months from this December morning, she would plant the entire 80-acre home place block in Bones's Black Amber, the open pollinated heritage line her grandmother had bred between 1928 and 1934 at the Texas A&M experiment station outside Lubbock. She would do it because her grandmother had told her to. She would do it because her mother had kept the line alive for 42 years. She would do it because it was the thing Ennis would have asked her to do. And she would do it alone. The testing began in January of 1977. Ida took 200 seeds from the glass jar and laid them out on damp paper towels in a shallow wooden tray. She set the tray on the kitchen windowsill where it would catch the winter sun. Twice a day, morning and evening, she misted the paper towels with water from a spray bottle. She counted the sprouts every morning at 6 and every evening at 6. She recorded the germination tally in pencil in the back pages of the leather notebook. After 19 days, 182 of the 200 seeds had germinated, 91%. The seed was alive. Ida stood at the kitchen counter with the wooden tray in front of her and the leather notebook open beside it. She looked at the germination rate. She looked at the date on the jar. 42 years. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the kind of care it took to preserve a seed line for 42 years in a sealed glass jar on a kitchen shelf. She thought about her mother checking that seal every year, replacing the desiccant packets, never letting the foundation stock touch air or light or moisture. She thought about faith, not the kind of faith that came from certainty, the kind of faith that came from choosing to believe in something you couldn't prove until the moment of testing arrived. She closed the notebook. She sealed the foundation jar. She began to prepare. Over the next 14 months, Ida worked through every step her grandmother had documented in the breeding notes. She cleaned and weighed the entire reserve stock. She separated the foundation seed from the working planting stock. She rebuilt the grain bin behind the milk house with a new cedar floor and fresh insulation in the walls. She calibrated the 4-row planter for the heritage seed's slightly larger kernel size by hand modifying the seed plates with a small file and a caliper her grandfather had bought at the Dimmitt hardware store in 1953. She wrote to the Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program in College Station in February of 1978 to ask whether they had any record of the Bones's Black Amber 1934 line. The program answered 3 weeks later. They had no record under that name. All heritage open-pollinated sorghum lines from the pre-1937 era had been deaccessioned from the program seed bank in 1953 due to space constraints. The seed in Ida Mosley's glass jar was as far as the Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program could confirm in March of 1978 the only surviving stock of the Bones's Black Amber line in the United States. Ida read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the leather notebook between pages 46 and 47, right next to her grandmother's letter from 1961. She understood what it meant. She was the last keeper of a line that existed nowhere else in the world. If she failed, the line would disappear. If she succeeded, it would continue. There was no middle ground. The men started talking in January. By February, the talk had reached the long Formica counter at the Dimmitt Cafe, where men in tall-crowned cream and tan stockman's cowboy hats sat between 5:30 and 7 in the morning, drinking coffee from chipped enamel mugs and arguing about the price of feed grain and the prospects for the spring wheat harvest. By March, the talk had become the dominant topic of conversation. The talk was about Ida Mosley. The talk was about what Ida Mosley was planning to do. The talk was about what Ida Mosley should not be planning to do. The talk was depending on who was doing the talking, concerned or amused or dismissive or some combination of all three. The talk was not cruel. It was the kind of small-town disbelief that wore the clothing of concern. Ida heard it at the seed dealer on a Wednesday afternoon in late February. She heard it at the First National Bank on the Saturday before Easter. She heard it at the First Baptist Church potluck on the third Sunday of April, when the minister's wife pulled her aside in the basement fellowship hall and asked her in a careful voice whether the heritage planting was something Ennis would have approved of. Ida had looked at the minister's wife across the corner of a folding card table that held a covered casserole and a glass pan of chess pie, and had said, "Ennis would have asked me what my mother thought." The minister's wife had said nothing. Ida had carried her pinto bean casserole back to the kitchen and washed her own dish. The loudest talk came from her brother-in-law. Cyril Briscoe was 58 years old in the spring of 1978. He was tall and lean and weather-worn, his face gone deep brown from 40 years of Texas panhandle sun and wind. He wore a tall-crowned, cream-colored stockman's hat with a sweat-stained band, a faded khaki canvas work jacket, dark blue Wrangler jeans, and scuffed brown boots. He farmed 1,200 acres on the section bordering the Mosley home place to the south and west. He had wanted the Mosley home place before Ennis died. He had wanted it more after. He had not, in the 4.5 years between Ennis's death and the spring of 1978, openly raised the subject with Ida. He had instead approached it sideways. He had stopped by on Sunday afternoons. He had brought casseroles his wife Imogene made. He had offered to disc her stubble in the fall. He had told her more than once that any decision she wanted to make about the operation would have his full support. Ida had thanked him. She had not leased the 80-acre block. She had disked her own stubble with the John Deere 402. When Cyril heard in late February that Ida was planning to plant the home place block in an open pollinated heritage line her grandmother had bred in 1934, he drove over to the Mosley gate on a cold Tuesday morning and sat in the cab of his truck for 10 minutes before he got out. Ida was kneeling at the south end of the 80-acre block with a hand trowel and a small canvas seed bag, checking the soil temperature. She heard the truck. She finished what she was doing. She stood. She walked across the freshly worked ground to the gate. Cyril was standing at the fence, his hat in his hands. "Ida," he said, "you want coffee?" No. She had expected the question. She had expected the visit. She crossed her arms. She waited. "Pell told me yesterday," Cyril said. "I came over today." "Ida, what in God's name are you planning to do?" "I'm planting 80 acres of Bones's Black Amber, the 1934 line my grandmother bred at the A&M station in Lubbock, the seed my mother kept on a shelf for 42 years. The line in the letter my grandmother sent me when I was 16. I'm planting it at 42,000 seeds per acre in north-south rows." "Ida," Cyril's voice was careful, "you're planting a 38-year-old open pollinated line on 80 acres of dryland in 1978. The Pioneer 8333 will out-yield your line by 3,600 pounds an acre. The DeKalb DK50 will out-yield it by 40. Your 80-acre yield gap at the autumn 1978 cash price of $410 a hundredweight is $12,000. You're going to lose $12,000 on a sentimental gesture to your dead mother." Ida did not move. "You can replant in May," Cyril continued. "The hybrid seed is on the shelf at the Dimmock Co-op for $140 a 50-pound bag. You can till the heritage under and replant on the same 80 in 2 weeks. I will pay for the replant seed. I will charge you no interest. I will take the disking off your hands. You can owe me until November. I'm not asking for a thing in return. I'm telling you what your husband would have told you if he were alive." He paused. He looked at her. "The hybrid is the future. The heritage is the past. Plant the future." Ida let the silence settle. Then she spoke. "Cyril, my grandmother said in 1961 that the hybrids will fail us in a year nobody is expecting. The line we made between 1928 and 1934 was selected for stem strength against hail and drought and the wind that comes off the Llano Estacado in May. The hybrids will out-yield us in good years. We will out-yield them in the years the weather is bad. I'm planting the line. I'm not replanting. I'm not tilling under. I'm not borrowing your seed. The 80-acre block is going to make a 1978 harvest of 4,200 pounds an acre. And it's going to do that every year until a year comes when the weather's bad. And in that year, the line is going to do what the hybrids cannot. And in that year, I'm going to be the only farmer in this county with a standing crop." Cyril stared at her. "Ida, you can't wait a decade for one bad year on a sentimental tribute. I'm not waiting a decade for one bad year. I'm farming the line every year because that's what my mother did and her mother before her. The 4,200 pounds is enough to pay the property taxes, pay the seed bill, pay the fertilizer, pay the diesel, and clear me a small profit. The bad year, when it comes, will be the bonus. I'm not asking you to understand this. I'm telling you what I'm doing so you don't have to ask me again. Cyril took his hat off. Then he put it back on. Then he took it off again. He looked across the freshly worked block. He looked back at Ida. Ida, I can't stop you. I can't help you. I'm going home. I'll watch what happens. He drove home. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with his wife Imogene and said, Imogene, my brother's widow has lost her mind. Imogene Briscoe set down a coffee pot. She looked at her husband. Cyril, you do not call her your brother's widow in front of me ever again. She is Ennis's wife, and she is your goddaughter's mother, and she is 32 years old, and she has buried a husband and a mother and a father all in 5 years. You will go over there tomorrow, and you will ask her what she has done, and you will listen to the answer. I went over today. Then you will leave her alone. Cyril said nothing. Imogene turned back to the stove. That girl, she said quietly, has more backbone than every man at the Dimmick Cafe put together. And if you can't see that, Cyril, then you're not half the man your brother was. The words landed hard. Cyril sat at the table for a long time after his wife left the room. He thought about his brother Ennis. He thought about the October afternoon in 1973 when the header bearing through and the arm came down and Ennis was underneath it. He thought about standing at the graveside and looking at Ida across the open ground and realizing she was alone now, and that he should have checked that bearing himself, and that he hadn't, and that nothing he could do would ever bring his brother back. He thought about the 1,200 acres he farmed. He thought about the 80 acres Ida was about to plant in a line nobody had heard of. He went to bed that night convinced she was wrong. He would spend the next 7 years trying to prove it. On the morning of March 12, 1978, Ida Mosley drove the John Deere 402 out onto the 80-acre block with a 4-row planter she'd borrowed from the Dimmitt Implement Co-op. The morning was cool and clear. The sky was pale blue, the kind of blue that came before the heat arrived. The red clay had been worked twice, disked smooth, the rows marked in straight north-south lines along the prevailing wind axis. She had calibrated the planter seed plates by hand with a small file and a caliper her grandfather had bought at the Dimmitt hardware store in 1953. She had filled the planter hoppers with 420 pounds of Bones's black amber seed, cleaned and weighed and separated from the foundation reserve she would keep sealed in the glass jar for the rest of her life. She set the depth, she set the spacing, she engaged the planter. The first seeds went into the ground at 6:45 in the morning. By noon she had planted 20 acres. By dusk she had planted 40. Pell Truscott, who worked for Cyril Briscoe and who had been driving past the Mosley home place on his way to check a windmill, saw Ida on the tractor and stopped his truck. He stood at the fence and watched her work for 15 minutes. Then he drove to the Briscoe place and told Cyril what he'd seen. Cyril didn't believe him. Cyril drove past the Mosley home place the next afternoon. He counted by the rough estimate of a man who had run a planter for 36 years, somewhere between 60 and 90 acres of freshly planted ground in straight north-south rows. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with his elbows on the oilcloth and his hat off. She did it, he said to Imogene. I know, Imogene said. The whole county's going to laugh. Let them. By the second Friday of April 1978, every farmer in Castro County had heard. The Dimmitt Cafe sat on Bedford Street between the Castro County Courthouse and the First National Bank. And on Tuesday and Friday mornings, between 5:30 and 7, the long Formica counter filled with men arguing about the same things they'd been arguing about for 30 years. On the second Friday of April, the dominant topic was Ida Mosley's heritage planting. The men at the counter talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Cyril Briscoe, who farmed 1,200 acres of irrigated hybrid grain sorghum and dryland wheat on the section south of the Mosley home place, told the story 4 mornings in a row. He told it again at the April Sorghum Producers Association meeting. He told it once more at the First Baptist Church coffee hour on the second Sunday of April. By the end of April, he had told it in some form to every farmer within 70 miles of Dimmitt. The story changed slightly with each telling. By the time it reached Ozell Pennington at the courthouse on the morning of April 26th, the story was that Ida Mosley had thrown away an 80-acre block on her dead mother's old-fashioned seed and was claiming on the authority of a 1961 letter from her grandmother that the heritage line would outperform the modern hybrid in some unspecified year of bad weather. The mockery in Dimmitt was not cruel. It was a kind of small-town disbelief that wore the clothing of concern. At the seed dealer on Wednesday afternoon, Ida heard a man named Asa Goodnight, who had taught her father how to set a windmill in 1948, tell another customer that the Mosley widow had let her grief get the better of her judgment. At the First National Bank on the Saturday before Easter, the bank manager pulled Ida aside after she had finished a routine deposit and asked her in a low and respectful voice whether she had thought through what the 80-acre yield gap was going to do to her household budget over the next 5 years. At the First Baptist Church potluck on the third Sunday of April, the minister's wife had already asked her question, and Ida had already given her answer. Ozell Pennington, the Castro County Extension agent who had served in the same office for 19 years, said it openly to anyone who would listen. He said it standing at the front of the Castro County Sorghum Producers Association meeting. He said it sitting at the counter of the Dimmitt Cafe at 7 in the morning. He said heritage sorghum is the kind of crop a man plants in 1978 to honor his grandmother. It is not the kind of crop a man plants to make a living. The Mosley widow is honoring her grandmother. Nobody should mistake the gesture for a business decision. It was not a controversial position. It was the professional consensus of the Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program, of the Castro County Extension Service, of every seed dealer between Amarillo and Lubbock, of every grain elevator from Hereford to Tulia. It was the consensus that open-pollinated heritage sorghum could not compete on yield, could not compete on uniformity, could not compete on harvest timing, and could not compete on grain test weight. It was the consensus that Mosley was throwing away an 80-acre block on a sentimental tribute to a dead mother. The men were still talking 7 years later on the afternoon of May 17, 1985, when a 50-mile-wide hailstorm dropped golf ball-sized ice across 4 contiguous Texas Panhandle counties for 43 minutes and flattened every standing field of hybrid grain sorghum from Hereford in Deaf Smith County to Tulia in Swisher County. And the only viable standing grain crop in any of those 4 counties was the 80-acre block of Bones Mosley's heritage black amber on the Mosley home place west of Dimmitt. The men stopped laughing that day. The 1978 harvest came in October. The 80-acre block yielded 4,300 pounds an acre on the dry side of the irrigation circle and 45 on the wet side. The grain test weight was 61 pounds per bushel against a Castro County hybrid average of 58. The grain protein was 12.4% against a hybrid average of 9.6. Ida sold the entire harvest to the Hereford Grain Cooperative at the cash price of $4.10 a hundredweight. The total revenue was $50,400 on an 80-acre block. After fuel and seed and fertilizer and the property tax allocation, the net was $19,200. The Briscoe operation at the same time on 1,200 acres of Pioneer 8-333 hybrid grain sorghum netted $76,000. The Briscoe operation netted on a per acre basis $63 an acre. The Mosley operation netted on a per acre basis $240 an acre. Cyril Briscoe did not, in the autumn of 1978, attribute the per acre difference to the heritage line. He attributed it to lower input costs on a smaller block. At the Dimmitt Cafe on a cold Saturday morning in early November, he told Ozell Pennington, the Castro County Extension agent, that one good cycle proved nothing. The real test, Cyril said, will come when we have a serious bad weather year. Ozell agreed. Ida, who was sitting 3 stools down the counter with a cup of coffee and a slice of pecan pie, heard every word. She didn't say anything. She finished her pie. She paid. She walked out. Behind her, she heard one of the younger men laugh. Just a small laugh, the kind people make when something is harmless. The years between 1978 and 1982 were the deep work years. Ida harvested the 80-acre block every October. She refreshed the seed every 5th year on a 5-acre selection plot on the north end of the home place, exactly as her grandmother and her mother had done before her. She kept the breeding records in pencil in the same leather notebook her grandmother had started in 1928. She added her own notes in the back pages. She sold the harvest grain to the Hereford Grain Cooperative every autumn. She sold a small reserve of selected seed to 2 retired farmers in Hale County who had been keeping their own heritage lines and who had heard about the Bones' Black Amber from a 1979 article in the Texas Farmer Stockman magazine that had described the heritage planting without naming Ida. The seed sale revenue was small, between $800 and $1,200 a year. It paid for the leather notebook refills. It paid for the trips to Lubbock to consult the A&M library archives. It paid for the small wooden bins Ida had built behind the milk house to store seed at controlled temperature and humidity. By the end of 1981, the 80-acre block had become in the unofficial assessment of every Castro County farmer who drove past on Highway 86, the most reliably productive 80 acres in the county. The heritage line consistently produced 4,200 to 4,600 pounds an acre with no irrigation supplementation and minimal nitrogen input. The hybrid blocks on the same soil type produced 75 to 8,200 pounds with full irrigation and maximum nitrogen. But the per acre net was lower because the input costs were so much higher. The Mosley operation was by 1981 generating $19,000 to $21,000 a year on 80 acres, while the Briscoe operation generated $70,000 to $80,000 on 1,200. The Mosley operation was making on a per acre basis 3 to 4 times the Briscoe operation. The men at the Dimmitt Cafe stopped making jokes about the heritage line in 1980. They simply stopped making them in front of Ida Mosley. The mockery moved sideways. By 1981, it had become a mockery that focused on the unusualness of the operation rather than on its performance. The men at the counter said that Ida had gotten lucky on input costs. They said that one good cycle proved nothing. They said that the real test would come when the Panhandle had a serious bad weather year. And they said it would be a shame if Ida Mosley had thrown away 7 years waiting for a year that never came. In the winter of 1982, Ida wrote a letter to a researcher at Texas A&M University in College Station named Dr. Harriet Ratliff. Dr. Ratliff was an associate professor of plant breeding. Her research program focused on heritage line genetic resources in dryland cereal crops. She had published in 1981 a paper in Crop Science titled Recovering Pre-Hybrid Sorghum Genetics from Operator-Maintained Heritage Plots. Ida had read the paper. She had bought a reprint from the journal office for $12.50. She had written Dr. Ratliff a letter on January 18, 1982, on a sheet of lined notebook paper and pencil describing her grandmother's Bones' Black Amber line, her mother's 42-year refreshment cycle, the 1978 planting, and the 4 years of yield records. Dr. Ratliff had answered 3 weeks later. She had said yes. She had said she could come in the spring of 1982 to see the line. Dr. Harriet Ratliff arrived at the Mosley Gate on the morning of April 14, 1982, in a 1979 maroon Plymouth Volare with 2 graduate student assistants from the Texas A&M Plant Breeding Department in the back seat and a yellow hard hat on the front passenger floorboard. She introduced herself to Ida at the gate. She asked to walk the 80-acre block on foot before they did anything else. Ida walked her out. The April light was long and copper across the freshly emerged seedlings. Dr. Ratliff stopped at the 3rd row. She knelt. She measured a seedling with a small ruler. She turned to Ida. Mrs. Mosley, the seedling vigor on this stand is 40% above the Pioneer 8333 reference plot at College Station. The cotyledon emergence is uniform. The stem caliper at the soil line is 23% above hybrid reference. I have not seen anything like this in 11 years of dryland sorghum research. I am here for 1 day. May I have 4? Ida gave her 4. Dr. Ratliff walked the block, sampled the seed bins, photographed the breeding notebook, and recorded the breeding history. She returned to the kitchen on the 4th evening. She sat across the Formica table from Ida. Mrs. Mosley, she said, your grandmother's 1928 to 1934 selection cycle at the Lubbock station was, by my professional assessment, the most rigorous, open-pollinated dryland sorghum breeding program of the pre-hybrid era in the southern Great Plains. The line you're growing is genetically distinct from any modern hybrid. It carries gene complexes for stem strength, hail tolerance, drought escape, and heat shock recovery that the hybrid breeding programs eliminated in the 1940s in favor of grain yield selection. Your line is in my professional assessment the only standing field expression of pre-hybrid Texas dryland sorghum genetics in the United States as of April 1982. I'm going to publish this. I will not name you. I will refer to your operation as a private cooperator. The agronomy community is going to spend the next 30 years trying to recover what your grandmother already had in 1934. Ida set her coffee cup down. Don't use my name, she said. Dr. Ratliff did not use her name. She published between 1983 and 1986 4 papers in Crop Science Agronomy Journal and Plant Breeding Reviews that referenced the Mosley operation only as Cooperator E. The papers were read by every sorghum geneticist at every land-grant university west of the Mississippi. None of them found Cooperator E. The years between 1982 and 1985 were harder than Ida let anyone see. In the spring of 1983, the First National Bank in Dimmitt called her in for a meeting. The bank manager, a man named Vance Holloway, who had gone to high school with Ennis, pulled Ida aside after she had finished a routine deposit and asked her in a low and respectful voice whether she had thought through what the 80-acre yield gap was going to do to her household budget over the next 5 years. You're making a profit, Ida, he said. I'm not saying you're not, but you could be making 3 times that profit if you switch to hybrid. The bank's been patient. We've carried the note on the implement loan since Ennis passed. But we can't carry it forever. I need you to think about your long-term plan. Ida had looked at Vance Holloway across the desk. She had known him since she was 16. He had been a pallbearer at Ennis's funeral. Vance, she said, I appreciate your concern. My long-term plan is to farm the line until the year the weather is bad. When that year comes, I'll have the only standing crop in 4 counties. That's my long-term plan. Vance had leaned back in his chair. Ida, what if that year never comes? Then I'll have farmed a line my grandmother bred and my mother kept alive for 58 years. That'll be enough. She had walked out of the bank that afternoon and sat in the cab of the C-30 grain truck for 10 minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. She thought about Ennis. She thought about the letter from her grandmother. She thought about the men at the Dimmitt Cafe who, still after 5 years, talked about her as though she were a widow playing at farming. She thought about the hybrid blocks on every farm in Castro County, standing tall and uniform and high yielding in the good years, and she thought about what her grandmother had written in 1961. When the hybrids fail you, it will be in a year nobody's expecting. She started the truck. She drove home. That night she sat at the kitchen table with the leather notebook open in front of her. She turned to the back pages where she kept her own notes. She wrote May 3rd, 1983. Bank meeting. Vance asked about long-term plan, told him I'm waiting for the bad year. He asked, what if it never comes? I didn't have an answer for that. She set the pencil down. She looked at the glass jar on the shelf, the foundation seeds still sealed inside, 49 years old now. She thought, what if he's right? What if I'm wrong? She let herself think it. She let the doubt sit there, heavy and real. Then she closed the notebook. She stood. She walked to the window. Outside, the 80-acre block was dark under the April stars. The seedlings were 4 inches tall, emerging strong, the stand uniform and vigorous. She thought about her grandmother walking the same ground in 1934, selecting for stem strength and hail tolerance, choosing the traits that would matter in the years nobody was expecting. She thought about her mother refreshing the line every 5th year for 42 years, never planting a hybrid, never doubting. She thought about faith, not the kind of faith that came from certainty, the kind of faith that came from choosing to believe when you couldn't see the end. She went to bed that night still carrying the doubt. But in the morning she went back out to the field. The 1983 harvest was good. The harvest yielded 4,400 pounds an acre. The grain test weight was 61 pounds per bushel. The protein was 12.5%. The net was $20,100. Ida sat at the kitchen table on a Saturday evening in late October 1983 and ran the numbers again. 5 years. 5 consecutive years of profitable harvest on the heritage line. Per acre net, consistently 3 to 4 times higher than the hybrid operations surrounding her. And still the men at the Dimmitt Cafe said she was waiting for a year that might never come. She thought about Vance Holloway's question. What if that year never comes? She didn't have an answer. She had faith. She had the letter. She had 58 years of breeding records that showed her grandmother had selected for exactly the traits that would matter in a hailstorm. But she couldn't prove it until the storm came, and the storm had not come. In the spring of 1984, a different kind of pressure arrived. Ida was at the Dimmitt Cafe on a Tuesday morning in early April, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee and the weekly issue of the Texas Farmer Stockman. 3 stools down, Cyril Briscoe was talking to Ozell Pennington about the spring planting schedule. The Mosley widow's been farming that heritage line for 6 years now, Ozell said. 6 years of decent harvest. But 6 years is not a weather cycle. 6 years is luck. Cyril nodded. He didn't look at Ida. My concern, Ozell continued, is that she's teaching the younger farmers the wrong lesson. She's showing them that you can ignore the extension service, ignore the seed dealers, ignore 50 years of hybrid breeding research, and still make money. That's a dangerous precedent. Ida set her coffee cup down. She turned on her stool. Mr. Pennington, she said, I'm not teaching anybody anything. I'm farming a line my grandmother bred. I'm making a profit every year. And I'm not asking the extension service for advice. Because the extension service has been telling farmers to abandon heritage lines since 1962. If that's a dangerous precedent, I'm comfortable with the danger. Ozell turned. He looked at her. Mrs. Mosley, he said carefully, I have nothing but respect for your family's history. But history doesn't change the fact that hybrid grain sorghum outyields open-pollinated heritage lines by 30 to 40% in good years. You're making a profit because you're keeping your input costs low. You're not making a profit because the line is superior. The line is inferior. It's just cheaper to run. Ida stood. She picked up her newspaper. She set $2 on the counter. Mr. Pennington, she said, my grandmother bred this line between 1928 and 1934 at the Texas A&M station in Lubbock. She selected for stem strength and hail tolerance. The hybrids were bred for yield and good weather. When the bad weather comes, we'll see which line is inferior. She walked out. Behind her, the cafe was quiet. Cyril Briscoe sat at the counter with his coffee cup in his hands. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything. But he thought about Ida's words for the rest of the morning. When the bad weather comes, we'll see which line is inferior. He thought about the way she'd said it. Calm, certain, not defensive, not angry, just stating a fact she believed as surely as she believed the sun would rise in the morning. He thought about his brother Ennis, who had believed in Ida's judgment even when Cyril hadn't. He thought about Imogene, who had told him 7 years ago that Ida had more backbone than every man at the Dimmitt Cafe put together. He finished his coffee. He paid. He drove home. That evening he sat at the kitchen table with Imogene and said, I think I've been wrong about Ida. Imogene looked up from the stove. It's taken you 7 years to figure that out. Cyril didn't answer. Imogene came and sat across from him. What changed your mind? I don't know, Cyril said. Maybe nothing's changed. Maybe I just finally heard what she's been saying all along. And what she's been saying, that she knows something we don't, that her grandmother knew something we forgot. Imogene reached across the table and put her hand on his. Cyril, she said quietly, your brother married a smart woman. Maybe it's time you started believing that. The 1984 harvest came in October. The yield was 4,500 pounds an acre. The net was $20,800. Etta was 38 years old. She had been farming the Bones' Black Amber line for 6 consecutive years. She had made a profit every year. She had kept the breeding records. She had sold small reserves of seed to heritage line operators in 3 counties. She had rebuilt the home place from a struggling operation into the most consistently profitable 80 acres in Castro County, and she had done it alone. In November of 1984, she sat at the kitchen table with the leather notebook open in front of her. She turned to the entry she'd written in May of 1983. The entry about Vance Holloway's question, what if the bad year never comes? She picked up the pencil. She wrote beneath it November 18th, 1984. 6 years now. 6 good harvests. The men at the cafe still think I'm waiting for something that won't happen. Maybe they're right. Maybe the bad year won't come in my lifetime. Maybe it'll come in my daughter's lifetime or my granddaughter's. But the line will be here when it does. That's what matters. The line will be here. She closed the notebook. She looked at the glass jar on the shelf. The foundation seed was 50 years old now, and it was still alive. By the morning of May 17th, 1985, Ida Mosley had been farming the Bones' Black Amber line for 7 consecutive years. The men at the Dimmick Cafe still talked about her. But the tone had changed. It was no longer mockery. It was no longer concern. It was something closer to resignation. The Mosley widow had made her choice. The Mosley widow was making a profit. The Mosley widow was by every measurable standard farming successfully on 80 acres of heritage sorghum that nobody else in Castro County would have touched. And the bad year she was waiting for had not come. On the morning of May 17, 1985, Cyril Briscoe sat at the counter of the Dimmick Cafe at 6 in the morning and drank his coffee and listened to the weather report on the radio behind the counter. High pressure across the panhandle. Dew point in the low 50s. Good growing weather. Looks like another good year, one of the younger men said. Even the Mosley widow will do fine. There was a small laugh around the counter. Cyril didn't laugh. He finished his coffee. He paid. He walked out. He drove to the Briscoe home place and spent the morning checking irrigation lines on the north section. The sorghum was at early boot stage. The stalks were tall and uniform, the panicles just beginning to emerge. It was shaping up to be a good year, maybe a great year. He ate lunch at the kitchen table with Imogene. They talked about the spring calving. They talked about the wheat harvest schedule. They talked about everything except what Cyril was thinking about. He was thinking about Ida. He was thinking about 7 years of watching her farm that heritage line, and 7 years of waiting for her to fail, and 7 years of her not failing. He was thinking about the conversation at the cafe that morning, the small laugh, the easy dismissal. He was thinking about the fact that he'd been part of that dismissal for 7 years. And he was thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong the whole time. That afternoon at 2 o'clock, a dry line pushed east out of New Mexico into Bailey County. By 3 o'clock, the dry line had reached the western edge of Castro County, and a line of supercell thunderstorms had begun to fire along its leading edge. By 3:45, the lead supercell had moved over Hereford and dropped golf ball-sized hail for 19 consecutive minutes across the western half of Deaf Smith County. The cell tracked east at 28 miles per hour. Cyril was in the equipment shed when he heard the first report on the radio. Severe thunderstorm warning for Deaf Smith County. Large hail reported in Hereford. Cell moving east at 30 miles per hour. He walked out of the shed and looked west. The sky was dark. Not the normal dark of a thunderstorm. The kind of dark that looked like something solid moving across the plains. He got in his truck and drove to the north section, where the sorghum was standing tall and green and vulnerable at early boot stage. The cell was still 20 miles west. He had maybe 30 minutes. He stood at the edge of the field and looked at 1,200 acres of hybrid grain sorghum that represented a year's work and $140,000 in gross revenue if the harvest came in clean. The sky to the west was black now. He got back in the truck. He drove east toward the Mosley home place. By 4:15, the cell was over the Mosley home place west of Dimmitt. Ida Mosley had been in the kitchen when the cell hit. She had heard the first hailstone strike the corrugated tin roof of the milk house at 4:14. She had heard the second at 4:14 and a half. By 4:15, the roof of the milk house, the roof of the equipment shed, the roof of the chicken house, and the windshield of the C-30 grain truck were ringing under a barrage of golf ball-sized hail that the National Weather Service in Amarillo would later record at an average rate of 340 stones per square yard per minute over a 14-minute peak. The kitchen window blew in at 4:21. Ida crossed the kitchen, pulled an oilcloth tarp off the back porch, and hand stapled it across the broken pane in 3 minutes. She did not look out at the 80-acre block. She knew what was happening to it. She knew what was happening to every other field in 4 counties. She sat down at the kitchen table at 4:25 with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and waited for the hail to pass. She thought about her grandmother's letter. When the hybrids fail you, it will be in a year nobody is expecting. She thought about 7 years of waiting. She thought about the doubt she'd carried since 1983. The question Vance Holloway had asked. What if the year never comes? The hail hammered the roof. She closed her eyes. She prayed. Not for her crop to survive. She'd already made her peace with whatever was coming. She prayed for wisdom, for strength, for faith. The hail passed at 4:33. Ida opened her eyes. The house was quiet. She stood. She walked to the back door. She opened it. The ground was white with hail. The air smelled like wet clay and bruised vegetation. The light coming through the broken clouds to the west was copper and gold. She walked from the back porch to the gate of the 80-acre block. Her boots crunched on hail. She opened the gate. She walked into the field. The leaves on the canopy were torn and bruised. The panicles at the top of every stalk were still attached. The stalks were bent, but they were not broken. Ida knelt. She touched one of the stalks. The stem was thick, fibrous, flexible. She pressed her thumb against it. It gave slightly, then held. She stood. She walked the first row, counting broken stalks. 8 in the first 100. She walked the second row. 9 in the first 100. The third row. 7. The fourth. 10. By 5 o'clock she had walked 20 rows. She estimated that the block had lost approximately 8% of its yield potential to the hailstorm. 8%. She walked back to the gate. She looked south toward the Briscoe operation. The hybrid fields were flat, completely flat, as though someone had taken a roller and pressed them into the ground. She stood at the gate for a long time. Then she saw the truck. Cyril's truck parked on the county road at the edge of the Briscoe North section. Cyril was standing at the fence looking at his fields. Ida walked toward him. She walked slowly, her boots still crunching on hail. The distance from the Mosley gate to the Briscoe fence line was half a mile. She walked it in silence. When she reached the fence, Cyril turned. His face was gray. Ida, he said. She didn't say anything. She looked at his fields. The hybrid sorghum was flat. Every stalk, 1,200 acres. The panicles were on the ground. The stalks were snapped at the base. It's gone, Cyril said. All of it. Ada looked at him. I'm sorry, Cyril. He nodded. He looked back at the field. Yours, he asked. Standing. Cyril closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. How much did you lose? 8%. There was a long silence. Then Cyril said very quietly, Your grandmother was right. Ida nodded. Yes, she was. Cyril took off his hat. He held it against his chest. I'm sorry, Ida. I'm sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry I laughed. I'm sorry I spent 7 years thinking you were wrong when you were right the whole time. I'm sorry I didn't believe in you the way Ennis did. Ida reached out and put her hand on the fence post between them. Cyril, she said, you're forgiven. He looked at her. Just like that. Just like that. Cyril shook his head. I don't deserve it. Maybe not. But you have it anyway. Cyril looked back at his fields. The flat broken stalks. The lost harvest. What am I going to do? He said. You're going to replant. And next spring, if you want, I'll sell you seed. Heritage seed. The same line that's standing on my place right now. Cyril turned to her. You do that, Cyril, she said. Your family. Of course I do that. He put his hat back on. He looked at her for a long moment. Thank you, he said. She nodded. They stood there together in the fading copper light, looking at the broken fields and the hail-covered ground and the clearing sky to the east, where the storm was moving away across the plains. Then Ida turned and walked back toward the Mosley home place. She walked slowly. She was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that came from 7 years of fighting for something nobody else believed in. But she had won, not because she'd been smarter, not because she'd been luckier, because she'd been faithful. She'd kept the line alive. She'd trusted her grandmother's word. She'd planted in the face of mockery and doubt and pressure. And the line had stood. When she reached the kitchen, she sat down at the table. She opened the leather notebook. She turned to the back pages. She wrote May 17, 1985. Hailstorm, 43 minutes, golf ball sized, 14 minutes on the home place block. Estimate 8% yield loss. Briscoe operation total loss. Cyril apologized at the fence. Told him he's forgiven. Grandmother was right. The year came. The line stood. She set the pencil down. She looked at the glass jar on the shelf. 51 years old now. And the seed was still alive. The telephone started ringing on the evening of May 18th. The first call came at 5:30 from Pell Truscott, who worked for Cyril Briscoe and who had driven past the Mosley home place that afternoon on his way back from checking a windmill. His voice on the line was quiet. "Miss Ida," he said, "the Briscoe operation is gone. 1,200 acres, 94% loss." Ada held the phone. "I'm sorry, Pell." There was a pause. Miss Ida Pell said, "Yours is still standing, isn't it?" "Yes, Pell, mine is standing." "I told them," Pell said. "I told them 7 years ago. I should have spoken up louder. It's all right, Pell." "No, ma'am, it's not." He hung up. The second call came an hour later, then the third. By 9 o'clock that night, Ida had received 6 calls from farmers in Castro County asking the same question. "Is your block still standing?" "Yes." "How much did you lose 8%? There was always a silence after that. "Then, can I come see it?" "Yes." By the end of the third week of May, every farmer in Castro County had heard. The story did not change in the telling. The hybrid was on the ground. The heritage was standing. The hail had dropped across a 50-mile wide track from Hereford to Tulia for 43 continuous minutes. The hybrid grain sorghum fields, which were at the early boot stage on May 17th, and which had been bred for grain yield with slender stalks, were leveled to the ground. The DeKalb DK50 was leveled. The Pioneer 8-3. 3-3 was leveled. The fields belonging to 17 Castro County farmers, 23 Hale County farmers, 14 Swisher County farmers, and 9 Deaf Smith County farmers were leveled. The total field crop loss across the 4-county tract was estimated by the Texas A&M Extension Service in the Federal Disaster Declaration paperwork filed on May 20th at $112 million. The Mosley 80-acre block at the same early boot stage on May 17th had lost 8%, 8% against 100%. The difference was the line. Bones's black amber selected for stem strength by Peary Mosley between 1928 and 1934 against the kind of panhandle weather event that Perrier had personally witnessed in 1929 and 1932, had a stem caliper 23% thicker than the modern hybrids. The leaves were larger and more leathery and absorbed the hail impact without tearing. The boot was protected by a tighter sheath. The stalks, when struck, bent without breaking. The hybrid sorghum bred for maximum grain yield in good weather with slender stalks and thin leaves had no defense against the hail. The line made the difference, and everyone in 4 counties knew it. On the morning of August 7, 1985, 12 weeks after the storm, Ida received a telephone call from a Hale County farmer named Burton Witham. Burton was 72 years old. He had inherited an old open-pollinated stand from his late uncle in 1979 and had been keeping it alive on a 5-acre plot without really knowing why. "Miss Ida," he said, "I heard about your block. I heard it stood through the hail. I'm calling to ask if you would sell me refreshment seed." Ida set her coffee cup down. "How much do you need?" 50 pounds. "I can sell you 50 pounds at 68 cents a pound. Cash on delivery. Delivery in October after I finish my harvest." "Yes, ma'am. I'm in." The second call came on August 9th from a Swisher County farmer named Ada Marston, who was looking at a complete replant on 600 acres. "I need 300 pounds, she said. "I can sell you 300 pounds. Same price, same terms. Thank you, Miss Ida." The third call, the fourth call, the fifth call. By the morning of August 22nd, Ida had taken 17 calls. By the end of August, she had taken 47. The 4 counties had lost their seed stock. The hybrid seed for the 1986 planting season would have to be bought new from Pioneer and DeKalb at retail prices that had climbed 38% on the regional shortage. Or the 4 counties could buy heritage seed from the only standing source within 500 miles. Hardy Briscoe drove over to the Mosley Gate on the morning of August 22, 1985. He was Cyril's son. He was 34 years old, He had been running the day-to-day operations on the Briscoe place for 6 years. He arrived at 7. He sat in the cab of his 1981 Ford F-150 and watched Ida walk from the milk house to the 80-acre block with a cotton seed bag on her shoulder and a leather pouch of dried sorghum heads in her left hand. She saw him at the gate. She walked over. She set the bag on the gate post. She stood at the driver's side window. "Hardy," she said, "you want coffee?" "No." "I came over to ask a question. My father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here. We've lost 94% of the standing crop on the home section. We're looking at replanting 1,200 acres in 1986 with a seed bill we can't float. I came over today to ask if you would sell us heritage seed. I don't know how much you have. I don't know what you'd charge. I came to ask." Ada set the bag down. "Hardy," she said, "I will sell you seed. The price is 68 cents a pound cash on delivery in the autumn of 1985 for delivery from my 1985 harvest reserves. The minimum order is 200 pounds. The order includes one consultation visit from me at the Briscoe operation in spring 1986 to set up the planter and to walk the seedling stand at 3 weeks. The fee covers that visit. There will be no follow-up consultation included in the price. If you want follow-up, the rate is $60 an hour." Hardy stared at her. "Aunt Ida," he said, "I'm in. Word travels in Castro County." By the end of August 1985, Ida had received 47 telephone calls from farmers in 4 counties who wanted heritage seed for the 1986 planting season. Ida sat at the kitchen table on the evening of September 4th, 1985, with a leather notebook and a pencil. She wrote down what she could supply. She had retained from the 1985 harvest reserves approximately 7,000 pounds of cleaned heritage seed. At 42,000 seeds per acre and 1,000 grain weight of 28 grams, 7,000 pounds, was enough seed to plant approximately 5,800 acres at standard density. She decided on the evening of September 4th that she would sell to a maximum of 48 farms at a maximum of 1,500 pounds per farm on a first-come, first-served basis from the existing telephone call list. The total revenue, if all 48 orders came in at the maximum, would be $48,960. She would work 80 hours a week from October through April, supervising orders, planning consultation visits, and refreshing her own seed reserves. She would hire Pell Truscott full-time at $14 an hour. She would teach the next generation of Texas Panhandle sorghum farmers what her grandmother had bred in 1934. The 1985 harvest came in October. The 80-acre block yielded 3,900 pounds an acre, 8% below the 7-year average, exactly as Ida had estimated in May. The grain test weight was 61 pounds per bushel. The protein was 12.5%. The total harvest was 31,200 pounds. The cash price at the Hereford Grain Cooperative on October 15, 1985, was the highest sorghum price the Texas Panhandle had seen in 7 years, because the hybrid losses across 4 counties had collapsed the regional supply. Ida sold at $6.40 a hundredweight. The total revenue was $19,968. After fuel and fertilizer and the property tax allocation, the net was $12,400. It was less than her 7-year average net. It was the only positive net any sorghum operation in Castro County recorded that year. By the second week of January 1986, 46 Castro County, Hale County, Swisher County, and Deaf Smith County farms had signed seed contracts. The Briscoe operation took the maximum 1,500 pounds. The first seed shipments left the Mosley operation in semi-tonnage burlap bags on the morning of March 3, 1986. Ida Mosley supervised every load. By the morning of April 15, 1986, the seed had been distributed to 46 Texas Panhandle farms, and Ida had visited each farm to walk the planter setup and the first seedling emergence. She drove the C30 grain truck 840 miles in the first 3 weeks of April, from the Briscoe operation south of Dimmitt to a small farm in Texas County, Oklahoma, north of Guymon, to a 140-acre operation outside Stratford, Texas, in Sherman County, to a 600-acre dryland farm in southwestern Kansas. She arrived at every gate at first light. She walked every planter setup with the operator. She corrected the row spacing on 3 operations where the planter had been calibrated for hybrid density. She corrected the planting depth on 5 operations where the operator had been planting too deep. She refused to charge for the corrections. She refused to charge for the extra trips. She drove home at dusk every night and slept in her own bed and started over at 4:30 the next morning. Each farm received the same consultation document. 14 typed pages, hand-typed by Ida on her grandmother's 1932 Royal Quiet Deluxe portable typewriter. The document included the planting density. It included the row spacing recommendation. It included a winter seed storage protocol. It included the 5-year refreshment cycle. It included the Perrier-Moseley 1934 hand-drawn flowering chart. It included a 1-page note in Ida's handwritten cursive that said, in part, do not crossbreed with hybrids. Do not buy seed from anyone else. Do not skip the refreshment cycle. The line was made for the bad years. The bad years will come. Cyril Briscoe drove over to the Moseley Gate on a cold Saturday afternoon in late October 1986, 1 year and 5 months after the May 17th storm. The 1986 harvest had come in 2 weeks earlier. The Briscoe operation had run heritage seed on the entire 1,200 acres. The yield had averaged 4,400 pounds an acre on dryland and 48 on irrigation. The total grain harvest at the autumn 1986 cash price of $3.90 a hundredweight had been more than $200,000 on the gross, comparable to a hybrid year in dollar terms, but produced with substantially lower input costs because the heritage line did not require the nitrogen rates the hybrids did. Cyril stood at the open gate of the Moseley 80-acre block. He looked at the freshly cut stubble. He looked back at Ida, who had walked out from the milk house with the leather notebook in her arm. He took off his tall-crowned, cream-colored stockman's cowboy hat. He set it against his chest. Cyril, Ida said, "You want coffee?" "No." He stood there for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I owe my brother's wife the home section. I owe my son's seed bill to a 1934 line my grandmother-in-law bred at the A&M station in Lubbock when I was 8 years old. I owe my friendship with my brother a debt I should have paid in 1978. I am asking forgiveness. I am asking it as a man who watched his brother's widow for 7 years and decided that the easier thing was to assume she was wrong. I would like to come stand at this gate one Saturday afternoon a season and learn what I should have learned in 1978. Ida unlatched the gate. She held it open. "Cyril," she said, "you are forgiven. You were forgiven the night Imogene sent you over here in April of 1978. You didn't need to come today. I did need to come today, Ida. Then come walk the stubble." He came in. He walked the stubble with her for an hour. He took the leather notebook from her hands. He read 3 pages. He gave it back. He drove home at dusk. The next Saturday he came back. The Saturday after that he came back. By the end of November 1986, he had come back 5 Saturdays in a row. He did not pay her for the visits. She did not ask him to. The Saturday visits became, in the Briscoe and Moseley families, a thing that was understood and not discussed. On the first Saturday of December, Cyril brought Hardy with him. On the second Saturday, he brought his farm manager. On the third Saturday, they walked the seed bins and talked about the 1987 refreshment cycle. The visits were quiet. There wasn't much conversation. Mostly Cyril and Ida walked the stubble or sat at the kitchen table with the leather notebook open between them, and Cyril asked questions about the breeding records, and Ida answered them in the short, calm sentences her grandmother had taught her. On a cold Saturday afternoon in late January 1987, after they'd walked the seed bins and checked the foundation jar, Cyril stood at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and said, "Ada, why did you forgive me so easy?" Ada looked at him. "Because holding on to it wouldn't change anything, and because you're family, and because Ennis would have wanted me to." Cyril nodded. He set his hat on the table. "I miss him," he said. "I know. I do too." There was a long silence. Then Cyril said, "I should have checked that bearing. I taught him how to run that swather. I should have checked it." Ida reached across the table and put her hand on his. "Cyril," she said, "it wasn't your fault. I've been carrying it for 13 years. I know. But you can put it down now." Cyril looked at her. His eyes were wet. "How?" "By forgiving yourself the way I forgave you. By coming here every Saturday and learning something new. By honoring Ennis, by honoring the work he would have done if he'd lived." Cyril picked up his hat. He put it on. He looked at her. "Thank you, Ada. You're welcome, Cyril." He drove home through the winter twilight, and for the first time in 13 years he felt something in his chest loosen. The Saturday visits continued. They continued through the spring of 1987, through the summer, through the autumn harvest, through the winter. They continued for 13 years until Cyril Briscoe's death in November of 1999. At the funeral held at the First Baptist Church in Dimmitt on a cold Saturday afternoon, the minister spoke about Cyril's life. He spoke about the farm, he spoke about the family, he spoke about the man who had spent the last 13 years of his life learning humility at the gate of the Mosley home place. At the graveside, Ida stood next to Imogene and Hardy and looked at the coffin being lowered into the red Texas clay. She thought about the October afternoon in 1986 when Cyril had asked forgiveness. She thought about the Saturday visits, the quiet walks across the stubble, the leather notebook open on the kitchen table, the way Cyril had learned to ask questions instead of giving answers. She thought about the fence post at the Mosley gate where Cyril had stood every Saturday for 13 years. After the service, Hardy came and stood beside her. "Aunt Ida," he said, "my father wanted me to tell you something. He said it 3 days before he died. He said the fence post at your gate was the most important place in his life after the birth of his children. He said it was the place he learned what it meant to listen. He asked if we could name it after him in the obituary." Ida nodded. "Of course, Hardy." The Castro County News ran the obituary on Wednesday, November 24, 1999. It included the line, "In lieu of flowers, the family asks that donations be made to the Texas A&M Heritage Sorghum Conservation Program. Cyril Briscoe will be remembered at the fence post at the Mosley Gate, where he stood every Saturday for 13 years to learn what he should have learned in 1978. Ida read the obituary at the kitchen table on a cold Wednesday evening. She set the newspaper down. She looked at the glass jar on the shelf. 65 years old now. The seed was still alive. The Castro County News ran a feature in its November 20th, 1986 edition under the headline, "The Heritage Line That Saved 4 Counties." The article was 9 column inches on the front page and continued for 16 more inside. Pell Truscott was quoted. He said, "I worked beside Ida for 7 years. I knew the line was right by 1981. I should have spoken up then. I'm sorry I waited until the storm hit." Goodnight was quoted. He had set Cleon Mosley's first windmill in 1948. He said, "I knew Peary Mosley. I bought a load of seed off her in 1955. I will say this once. The granddaughter is what the grandmother was. And what the grandmother was the smartest plant breeder this panhandle has produced." I'm sorry I didn't say so in 1978. Cyril Briscoe was quoted. He said, "I owe my brother's widow my farm. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve to call her my sister." Dr. Harriet Ratliff at Texas A&M University was quoted. She said, "We have known about the Mosley operation since the spring of 1982. Mrs. Mosley asked us to keep her name out of the literature. We did. We are no longer going to. The Mosley operation is the foundation of heritage sorghum genetic recovery in the southern Great Plains. It is as far as we have been able to measure the most genetically distinctive heritage sorghum stand in the United States. It has been quietly maintained for 52 years by 3 generations of one family on a single 80-acre block in Castro County, Texas." The article noted in its final paragraph that the Mosley operation had been the only sorghum field still standing in 4 counties on the morning of May 18, 1985. It noted that 46 Texas Panhandle farms had ordered Bones's Black Amber Heritage seed from the Mosley operation for spring 1986 delivery. It noted that the Texas A&M Sorghum Improvement Program had filed a research proposal with the United States Department of Agriculture to establish a regional heritage line conservation program based on the Mosley line. The article did not note, because Ida Mosley had not told the reporter, that the leather notebook on file at the Mosley operation had been started by Peary Mosley at the Texas A&M Experiment Station outside Lubbock in March of 1928, that the notebook contained handwritten breeding records for 58 consecutive growing seasons, and that the seed Ida had planted on the 80-acre block in March of 1978 had been refreshed every 5th year by her mother Bones between 1948 and 1976. in a 5-acre selection plot on the same red Texas panhandle clay her grandmother had selected in 1928. 420 pounds of seed, 80 acres of red Texas panhandle clay, a seed keeper's daughter. Ida Mosley farmed the home place for 26 more years after the hailstorm. She ran the heritage seed business from 1985 until 2012. By the end of her career, more than 240,000 pounds of Bones's black amber seed had been distributed to farms across the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, and southwestern Kansas on more than 900 working operations. The 1934 line is now held in formal conservation status at the United States National Plant Germplasm System. The original glass jar her grandmother carried home from Lubbock in 1937 sits today in a glass-fronted cabinet in the kitchen of the home place. The seed inside is 88 years old, and it is still alive. Ida Mosley never told the story of the May 17th storm to anyone outside her family. She did not need to. The county told it for her every harvest from 1985 forward. In the spring of 2004, a graduate student from Texas A&M drove to the Mosley home place to conduct an oral history interview for the university's Heritage Agriculture Archive. The student sat at the Formica kitchen table with a tape recorder between her and Ida, who was 58 years old, now her hair gone gray, her hands weathered from 40 years of Texas sun and work. The student asked about the hailstorm. She asked about the 7 years of waiting. She asked about the mockery and the doubt and the pressure. Ida answered every question in short, calm sentences. At the end of the interview, the student asked one more question. "Mrs. Mosley," she said, "how did you know your grandmother was right? How did you have the faith to wait 7 years for a storm that might never have come?" Ida looked at the glass jar on the shelf. "I didn't know," she said. "Not the way you mean. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't show anybody the data that would make them believe. All I had was a letter written in 1961 by a woman who'd spent 6 years selecting me for a weather event she'd witnessed in 1929 and 1932. All I had was 58 years of breeding records that said she'd done the work right. All I had was the fact that my mother had kept the line alive for 42 years without ever doubting. And I had to choose whether I believed them or whether I believed the extension service and the seed dealers and every man at the Dimmitt Cafe who told me I was wrong." She paused, and I chose to believe them. Not because I knew they were right, because I chose to have faith that they were right. Faith isn't knowing. Faith is choosing to believe when you can't know. And sometimes if you're very lucky, you get to see the thing you believed in come true. The student turned off the tape recorder. She looked at Ida for a long moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Mosley," she said. Ida nodded. After the student left, Ida sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She opened the leather notebook. She turned to the back pages where she kept her own notes. She wrote, April 22nd, 2004. Texas A&M student came for oral history. She asked about faith. I told her the truth. Faith is choosing to believe when you can't know. That's what grandmother did. That's what mother did. That's what I did. The line stood because we chose to believe it would. That's the only reason that matters. She closed the notebook. She looked out the window at the 80-acre block. The sorghum was 6 inches tall, emerging strong and uniform in the spring light. 26 years since the hailstorm. 76 years since her grandmother had started the breeding cycle. The line was still growing, and it would still be growing long after Ida was gone. Ida Mosley died in her sleep on a cold January morning in 2017. She was 70 years old. The funeral was held at the First Baptist Church in Dimmitt on a Saturday afternoon. The church was full. Farmers came from 4 counties. Dr. Harriet Ratliff came from College Station. Researchers came from the National Plant Germplasm System. They came to honor a woman who had kept a seed line alive for 39 years. A woman who had waited 7 years for a storm nobody believed would come. A woman who had taught the Texas Panhandle what it meant to have faith in something bigger than yourself. At the graveside, Hardy Briscoe stood beside Ida's niece and looked at the coffin being lowered into the red clay. He thought about his father who had stood at the Mosley gate every Saturday for 13 years. He thought about the October afternoon in 1986 when Cyril had come home from that first visit and said to Imogene, "I think I just met the strongest person I've ever known." After the service, Dr. Ratliff came and stood beside Hardy. "Your family owes her everything," she said. Hardy nodded. "I know. We all do." They stood together in the cold January wind and looked at the grave. Then Dr. Ratliff said, "The line will continue. We've established it in the national system. We've distributed it to 200 conservation farms. We've trained 50 seed keepers in 5 states. What she started in 1978 will outlive all of us." Hardy looked at her. That's what she would have wanted. Yes, it is. The fence post at the Mosley Gate still stands. In the spring of 2018, the Castro County Historical Society placed a bronze plaque on the post. The plaque reads, "The Mosley Gate, in honor of Peary Mosley, 1899 to 1962, who bred the Bones's Black Amber Heritage Sorghum line between 1928 and 1934 at the Texas A&M Experiment Station in Lubbock, in honor of Bones Mosley, 1934 to 1976, who maintained the line for 42 years. In honor of Ida Mosley, 1946 to 2017, who planted the line in 1978 and whose 80-acre block was the only standing sorghum field in 4 counties after the hailstorm of May 17, 1985. 3 generations of women who believed the land would tell you what it needed if you learned how to listen." The 80-acre home place block is still farmed today by Ida's niece, who plants Bones's Black Amber every spring in straight north-south rows at 42,000 seeds per acre, exactly as Peary Mosley documented in 1934. The leather notebook started in March of 1928, now contains 96 consecutive growing seasons of breeding records. The glass jar, sealed in 1937, still sits in the kitchen cabinet. The foundation seed inside is 88 years old. And every 5th year on a 5-acre selection plot on the north end of the home place, a seed keeper walks the rows with a canvas bag and a leather pouch, selecting the best heads, cleaning the seed, refreshing the line. The way Perry did, the way Bones did, the way Ida did. The line nobody wanted in the hands of the women nobody understood, growing on 80 acres of red Texas panhandle clay under the wide blue sky. The line that stood when the hybrids failed. The line that stands today. If you have ever planted a seed, your grandmother left you. If you have ever chosen faith over certainty, if you have ever waited for a year nobody believed would come, the story is for you. 420 pounds of seed, a letter written in pencil, a storm that came in the 7th year. The county remembers, the land remembers, and 3 generations of women who kept a line alive are remembered every autumn when the combines roll across the red clay plains and the heritage sorghum stands tall against the Texas sky.